So we are part of Children's Health Council. If you're not familiar with it, it's co-sponsoring this with Penn, which is also now part of our Children's Health Council, and we've been around for quite a while. Roughly 2/3 of kids with ADHD as a primary diagnosis have other problems that complicate both assessment and also treatment. And we really have to hone in on what else is going on, because often if we don't diagnose the real problem that is causing the most difficulties, we may be doing wonderfully with the ADHD, but not actually helping the child very much. The symptoms can, in some ways, mimic each other, and we're going to be talking about what that means and in terms of trying to disentangle them, but also when they're both present, how that may affect the child and the family. We're going to try to help distinguish between the two. What about each of those conditions that needs treating? Where do you begin? What kind of interventions are available, and what elements are there of a good treatment plan? We are, much as I usually like to do so, we're not going to really take questions during the talk, because we're pretty tight to begin with, and I think that would guarantee we would never get close to done. So I'm going to start with ADHD. Most of you are probably familiar with that. It stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. There are three main subtypes. The most common is the so-called combined type. The symptoms are listed here. They're poor attention, high distractibility, poor impulse control, and high physical activity. The latter two, impulse control and physical activity issues, are what constitute impulsive and hyperactive. Distractibility and poor focus are the inattentive type. Many kids get diagnosed about age 7 or 8, not because that's when the symptoms appear, but because they begin to really differentiate themselves from their peers who don't have these issues, especially in the school setting. We believe that it's a disorder that's probably present from birth, but it becomes a problem when social expectations exceed whatever the person's abilities happen to be. And that may vary depending on which symptom you have. So, for example, if you're mainly inattentive, you may not actually end up getting into difficulties until age 10 or 11 or even 12, because that's when society really begins to expect kids to pay attention and focus and stay organized, which is not a strength for these individuals. If you're impulsive and hyperactive, that may show up as young as age 2 or 3 because you keep doing things in preschool, gets you kicked out of preschool, and that becomes very difficult for parents. General points, ADHD is a chronic disorder. We believe that roughly a third of individuals either outgrow it or more likely develop ways of coping with it so that it's not impairing by the time they're adults. But the other 2/3 continue to have significant symptoms. And impairments can take many forms, and we'll be talking about some of those. Important note is that issues change with time. This is not necessarily because of the child, but because of the external expectations. As things become more complicated, differentiate elementary school, where you have one teacher and one class, versus middle school and high school, where you have multiple teachers and competing demands. You can imagine that if you're not well organized to begin with, that becomes much more difficult. And there are a variety of treatment strategies, both medication and non-medications, that have really been shown to be quite effective in helping with the symptoms. We don't, unfortunately, have anything that treats the disorder itself, but we can certainly reduce symptoms, and a lot of times both non-medication and medication strategies are needed. Anxiety.
Well, good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Chris Harris. I'm the director of the Esther B Clark School. Anxiety disorders are very different from being anxious. You have all experienced being anxious at one time or another. I've given you some examples on the slides, and that is a perfectly normal feeling to have. As a matter of fact, I can tell you I felt a little anxious last night and didn't sleep all that well. But they come and they pass. And so the difference in it is that for kids with true anxiety disorders, it doesn't pass. It actually debilitates their ability to function in society and at school, and it can be actually a very debilitating condition for them to try to manage. So I want to tell you a little bit about how anxiety comes to be and why it's so persistent. It's a very difficult condition to treat, especially in a school that is actually one of the precipitators for the onsets of anxiety. So one's perception about how things are going to go often dictates how we interpret those events, and they always trigger feelings. Like, you never see anything objectively. Anything you ever see or do or hear triggers some kind of emotional reaction, but most of the time you're able to contain it. Kids who have anxiety disorders, it really begins to impact on how they think about things and how they feel about things, and therefore how they act or feel or think towards themselves, towards others, and towards the tasks that are given to them. Now, the thing that really complicates here is once they develop a negative perception of their ability to be able to handle a task, the human being actually can make that happen. They can actually manufacture that interaction or event to fulfill the catastrophe that they think is going to happen. And this is very difficult because what's happening inside their head is they're giving themselves very negative messages, and those negative messages actually set them up for the failure that they then experience, which then validates their feeling that it was all going to be a disaster to start with. Okay, so you can see how once that cycle goes, it becomes a very, very hard and difficult situation for them to correct. And we're going to talk a little bit about treatments later, but most kids who have anxiety are going to have a predisposition to becoming anxious in situations where they may feel a level of anxiety disproportionate to the actual situation. And that's what actually one of the key definitions of anxiety, feeling overly anxious about something disproportionately and having it actually rule the way they think and conduct their life. So let me give you an example of what that looks like. It's as simple as ABC. There's always going to be an activating event. And then from that activating event, a youngster or an adult is going to develop a belief about the outcome and about their ability to be able to manage that. And that's going to create a consequence. And I'm going to give you an example on the next slide. So here we have a Jean who's age 16 and holds a 3.8 GPA in all subjects but math. And she has a final exam in Algebra 2 tomorrow. And though she's worked hard on her assignments during the unit, her average is only a 74. So her belief, I just know I'm not going to do well on this test. Doesn't matter how hard I work, this isn't going to go well for me at all. So the consequence that she does is she says she quits studying early that evening, watches TV until midnight, and the next day on the exam, she gets a 76. To which she says to her mother, "See, I told you I wouldn't be able to do well on it." Okay, do you see how that was a self-fulfilling prophecy, that she believed she was going to fail, actually inadvertently and subconsciously set herself up to be more likely to fail, and then there was a self-fulfilling prophecy in doing that. So we're going to go into how we work on that, and we're going to talk a little bit, Glen's going to talk a little bit about the similarities, and then we'll talk about the differences, because it actually is important for us to pull apart kids who have attention deficit disorders and kids who are actually suffering from anxiety disorders, even though they may look very similar in a classroom or at home.
It feels like musical chairs. So ADHD and anxiety can look very much alike, and they both, and not only that, but they can both occur in the same individual. So we're really dealing with two sets of problems. One is something that looks like anxiety actually a result of ADHD or vice versa, and also are the two present together, and how are we going to figure that out? Anxiety disorder is mainly confused in particularly young adolescents with so-called inattentive ADHD. So anxiety doesn't typically make you hyperactive, although it can make you very fidgety, and it doesn't usually make you impulsive, but it certainly can affect your attention. If you're sitting there ruminating about how horrible something's going to happen tomorrow or what happened previously, you may have trouble focusing on the here and now and actually be listening in class. And this can become a significant issue. And it's important for a variety of reasons. There are some medical conditions that may increase the likelihood of anxiety, so we may need to actually pursue that. In terms of therapy, the approaches are really quite different. Educationally, the approaches also may be different, and then socially, obviously, kids with anxiety or ADHD can have social difficulties, but the kind of problems they have are going to be different. So similarities in appearance. So both can look very highly distracted. There's a difference between being distracted and being distractible. So most anxious kids are distracted because of their inner thoughts. A lot of ADHD kids get distracted because of what's going on around them. So if a kid is able to sort of stay distracted and undistracted in a quiet environment, that may suggest anxiety. Most classrooms are not, despite the teacher's wishes otherwise, the essence of quietness and stability. So both can become quite fixated and perseverative about a particular issue, not wanting to start something, not wanting to quit. Usually the ADHD individuals are really very focused on the here and now. They're playing a game, they don't want to stop playing the game, they certainly don't want to start doing their homework, whereas the anxious individual is much more worried about perceived failures in the past and what may be going on in the future. So if you inquire about that, you usually can help distinguish. But the symptom in terms of what you actually see immediately can look very, very similar. They both neglect relevant and important incoming stimuli. What that means is that they are so, on the one hand, the kids with ADHD just don't pay attention. They don't notice what's going on around. And on the other hand, the anxious kids are having so much, being so preoccupied with what their thoughts are and what their worries are that they may just not notice. So one of the wonderful things about ADHD individuals, I have a son who has inattentive ADHD, is that they often just almost immediately forget previous experience. So my son has sleep problems, and he's 33 now, but certainly when he was younger, still does, but certainly when he was younger had sleep problems. He would wake up every morning and say, wow, I really slept poorly last night, as if that was the first time he'd ever done that, even though weeks had gone by and every morning was the same. Anxious individuals tend to do the opposite. They have so much trouble, they're so preoccupied with what's happened and what may happen that they're not likely to pay as much attention to what's going on in the here and now. Both of them have the perception that what's happening to them is the whole truth. They have a lot of trouble sort of putting it in context, understanding that maybe this isn't them, or maybe it's not somebody else, that it's the situation that's causing the problem. And particularly with ADHD kids, because they don't really remember the past, they can get very fixated on the challenge being overwhelming and not being able to recognize what might be causing it. They are both best supported through a combination of parent training and teacher training to get them environments in which they can be things are more logical and more structured and more obvious to them. Also medication can be a real help with both anxiety and ADHD, but they're very different kinds of medications. So the specific needs are clearly distinct from each other, which is why we're really, we spend a lot of time trying to look at whether one, the other, or both are really present.
So as you can see, for these individuals, ADHD is all about a here and now thing and being gratified in the here and now, to the neglect of past experiences, which is why I think parents and teachers get frustrated with these youngsters, because you would have thought, you would assume that you would learn from past experiences, and that's a hard thing to do if you have truly ADHD. Whereas the anxiety youngsters are looking at you like they're paying attention, but they're absolutely ruminating on either the catastrophe that's looming in the future or the horrible experience that they've just incurred in the past. So the reason we're actually giving this seminar is so you can help your professionals, if you're working with professionals, help them delineate this, because they really are two quite distinct, they have distinct characteristics, but the bad news is that you can also have both. So I can't say one or the other. Hopefully it is only one or the other, but it certainly has been, they certainly have been what we call comorbid. Okay, so as you can see, there are going to be situations. I'm going to give you some examples of how, in certain situations, the anxious youngster is going to look and appear differently than the ADHD youngster, and I'll give you some examples right now. So one of the areas is time management. With ADHD youngsters, everything is right here and now. The past doesn't really exist, the future doesn't exist, and these are kids who have a terrible idea when you say, I need you to stop in 5 minutes. They have not a clue what that means. They'll either stop right then or they won't ever stop. And so their internal time clock is fairly dysfunctional. Whereas the anxious youngster is going to think that, oh my God, if I don't get ready at 5 minutes, the world is going to collapse on me, and we're going to have, I'm going to get in terrible trouble. The teacher will hate me. They'll probably throw me out of school. I'll get an F in this class, and I'll never get to high school, and I'll be homeless when I grow up. And literally, this is the kind of rumination and exaggeration and catastrophizing that anxious kids with anxiety disorder fear. They will be fearful of not being ready for class, and they'll express that to you. I've got to be ready. You don't understand. If I don't have these materials ready and ready to go in my backpack, Mrs. Smith is really going to hammer me. Okay? So they're ruminating, and again, what the emotions and the intensity of those emotions that they're feeling are disproportionate to the situation that they're incurring. Another area is material management, and I have a lovely wife. She's actually in charge of this conference, but she is chronically in a state of disorganization, and that's why she wants me pretty close to her after the seminar. And one of the funny things is she has duplicates of everything because she can't find them in the moment. So she has 15 hairbrushes and 5 packets of cosmetics and whatever it is, and she always knows she can find one of those. For the anxious youngsters, they also are fearful and panic-stricken if they can't find something, and so they also may collect a lot of materials because they're so afraid of not having it when they actually need it. See, the ADHD kids aren't really invested in that. What they want to do is they just know that they're going to not have it, and so they get it. They just go out and buy it sort of impulsively, right? But the kids with anxiety actually are really fearful of the consequences of not having that material ready, and they will load up with materials to make sure that they have something ready to go. And again, what they're perceiving is if they don't have those needed materials, disastrous consequences will then ensue. Okay, episodic perception. So this is experience, like how they relate to experiences and what they have understood that's going on in their lives. So the ADHD kids are all about here and now, in this moment. Am I gratified? Is this happening? Are things happening what I need? And so whatever has happened in the past has very little bearing on what they're dealing with right now. And I think Glenn gave you a great example, and that's in the sleeping anecdote that he told. So the problem is, and this is particularly for teachers too, one of the key components of learning in school is the ability to be able to make associations and see patterns. And ADHD kids, because they live in these snapshot moments, actually have a hard time doing that because they're not attentive long enough to make the associations or see the patterns that are really necessary to be an effective learner in school. So that's one of the problems that ADHD kids have. So in anxiety, the past and the future obviously have exaggerated impact on what's happening right now. And they really are being fairly attentive to right now because they're so concerned about how the past is going to impact them now and how the future looms as potentially catastrophic for them moving forward. So in filtering, in ADHD, it's one of the things that's true about ADHD is they're trying to attend to everything. They're not filtering well, so they're not prioritizing. So if Jeremy over here moves a muscle, I'm going to pay attention to that. If somebody's moving in the back, I'm going to be more attentive to that. And whatever is happening in the environment in that moment, deserves that momentary attention. But you can see how interruptive or interrupting that is. But the funny thing is that they feel like they actually are in control of the situation by attending to everything that's happening around them, when in fact, that's not obviously true. For the youngsters with anxiety, the misperception is that everything needs to be accounted for in order to plan for the future. But as they try to filter it, they're not filtering it correctly, so what they're doing is looking at the negative aspects of everything that's been done in the past or everything that might happen in the future. So when you look at anticipating or planning, they're doing it from a very negative perception, and that's causing them a lot of fear, which is why you may see kids with anxiety disorders stop going out of the house, stop going out of their room. They don't want to go to family events anymore. Some of them don't want to go to school, and we're seeing actually an increased number at EBC school of kids like this who are just so anxiety riddled that they don't leave their bedroom. Everything else is perceived as unsafe. So that obviously leaves them feeling absolutely powerless and with the sense and the misperception that they can't do anything about it. That everything else is going to have to change in order for their life to get more manageable. Okay, and then lastly, finding gratification. Okay, you know your ADHD kids need it instantaneously, they need a lot of it, they need it front-loaded, and oftentimes what you find out is 5 minutes later they need another set of gratifications and reinforcements, and then they need another set because it wears off faster than a Milky Way bar can be eaten. And then there's sort of this sense in the moment that the kids have had their mission accomplished. They've actually fulfilled what they need to do in that moment, and we'll just go on to the next one when in fact the mission isn't accomplished and they have a misperception of actually how far they've gotten on the task that they're supposed to do. And any of you who've had to go back and edit ADHD kids' writing, you well know that when they've perceived the task to be done, it is actually far from being done. So in our anxiety youngsters, they actually have a very diminished ability to be able to be gratified by external rewards or acknowledgments. They think they're being put on, that somebody's just placating them. They have a hard time accepting rewards and acknowledgement because inside of their head is, I know they're just placating me and the next steps are going to be disastrous. The future holds hopelessness and disaster, which looms in the future. So they don't respond actually very well to gratification at times because they actually don't believe that because their perception of life is so different than the ADHD kids. Okay, and problem solving, so this is kind of interesting. So if you can picture, I'm going to give you some visuals here. If you can picture a mirage or a mural, not a mirage, a mural. Two different things. Very different things. I'm not giving you a mirage, honestly. So a mural of photographs that are separate photographs, okay? So picture a whole sheet of separate photographs. That is actually sort of indicative of how ADHD kids look at life. These barely associative photographs that line up and progress through a day or through an hour or through an activity. Whereas the anxiety youngster actually makes a movie. They actually create a movie, but that movie is of a character who is unable to solve the problems that they're burdened with. So the movie goes on and on, but the main character, who is really themselves, is actually unable to solve the problem or the challenge. And most of you who've read literature knows that there's always a character, and the idea in a story is that character undergoes change, they're able to solve problems, whatever it is, and for our kids with anxiety, they have so little control over their life that they believe life is basically externally controlled over them, that they're powerless to be able to change their future and their life moving forward, and it results in this feeling of helplessness. Okay, so Glen's going to start building you a treatment plan.
So one of the interesting problems with kids with ADHD is that, as Chris said, that they feel like they're in control when in actuality what their actions are end up causing the opposite reactions that they anticipate. So this is particularly bad with peer relationships. So a kid thinks, I want to go join that group, decides that the best way to do that is to jump on the back of an unsuspecting peer who's facing the other way, and then can't understand why that that individual gets upset and everybody else gets upset, and then is mystified by the fact that people he wants to be friends with don't want to be friends with him. And that can begin to affect both mood and sort of self-esteem, but it affects it in an odd way, in that they truly have no idea what their contribution to all of that is. From their point of view, they're just trying to be friends. So what do we do about all of this? There are a number of components for both treatment of both anxiety and ADHD, whether both present or separately. What we've discovered for both is that a really structured behavior component, both at home and at school, can be enormously beneficial. It can be reassuring. For ADHD kids, it literally can boil down to, even though they've done the same morning routine thousands of times, they may need a list to help them walk their way through what they need to do in the morning, because after all, it's a new day. And they don't know what, they don't remember that they're supposed to brush their teeth after they eat, not before. Another area that's actually gaining a lot of attention, and it's probably more potent for anxiety than for ADHD, but it's the best we've got for either, is small group settings of peers with social thinking, where they actually walk through how do you introduce yourself to a stranger, how do you make a connection with another peer, and practice it so that they actually can begin to experience some success in that. And that can be helpful for both anxious and ADHD kids. For high energy kids, and a lot of kids with ADHD do have a fair amount of overflow energy, it can be really important to give some high energy activities during the day, give deliberate breaks. What you want to do is to do that before they fall apart instead of afterwards. So what you'd like to do is to reward them for holding it together by saying, let's take a 5-minute break and you can go run around the track or do something else that involves getting some energy out and doesn't involve their sitting there. There have been some classes that have tried to sort of incorporate that in the classroom with bouncy chairs and a variety of other things. And for some kids that works. For a lot of kids, it's just another distraction that guarantees that you're not going to actually pay any attention to the teacher. One of the keys that we often fail both in school and clinical situations and at home is the need for rapid feedback. Kids with ADHD particularly, as Chris mentioned, they need that sort of instant gratification. With really severe ADHD, literally some of the behavioral programs start with every 5 or 10 minutes they get a positive feedback. And one of the goals is to spread that out as kids get more used to the program, but the idea of saying if you're good for a week, then something wonderful is going to happen on Saturday is guaranteed to fail. There is no ADHD kid I'm aware of who knows what a week feels like. It's that sense of timing again. So what they're going to end up feeling like is, okay, I've failed already. It's only day 2. Why bother for the rest of the week? I'm done. So what you need to do is to find out where they are in terms of how long they can hold an idea, and make sure that you give them a positive reward within that time period, so that they can hopefully use that to keep going. For more anxious kids, opportunity for reflection, some emotional first aid, some reality testing about how catastrophic or how teachers are actually reacting can be very helpful. Parent support, unfortunately, well, most of us aren't trained to be parents anyway. It's always fascinating to me that we have to get a license to drive, but not to parent. There are some wonderful programs available now that are sort of graded about sort of how difficult things are, from just sort of kids who don't require a whole lot of effort and don't have any particular problems, up through kids like the ones that we're talking about. And then the last part is these kids may need medication. There are medications that can really help with both ADHD and anxiety. Although there's some overlapping ones, a lot of them are different, and each of those requires some monitoring. And that has to be done by a prescribing physician.
So the C's on the board are basically some of the practice principles that we use at Esther B. Clark with our kids who have anxiety and actually with ADHD. So the first thing is that we practice as a staff of being calm, regardless of whatever the situation is, because these kids tend to be hypervigilant about how the adults are responding to particular situations. And so if we can model calmness, we can actually abate some of the panic and fear that the kids with ADHD have, and the overstimulation or the distractibility that our anxiety kids have, and the overstimulated part that our ADHD kids have. So we use lots of check-ins. One of the most important treatment plans, part of the components what is your emotional state right now? How are you feeling? What is your level of energy, and what is your basic mood? And we actually work with kids very specifically on expanding their vocabulary, of being able to express their emotional state and their mood. And then with that, we actually help them just develop and practice coping mechanisms which are going to address their particular emotional state. So if they happen to be at a high energy and feeling very agitated, we help them develop a plan that takes care of that and brings them down to baseline. If we have youngsters who are apathetic and fearful and want to withdraw, we actually develop coping strategies and actions that they can take to actually elevate their level of energy and widen their ability to be able to process with adults. All of this is really important. Consistency and routine, and I know this is a hard thing to do on the peninsula with double work, double employment a lot of times, but the more kids get into a routine, the less they're concerned about what happens next. And so those of you who have kids with anxiety, the more routine you can get, the more consistent that routine can be executed, the lower the anxiety is for the youngsters who are basically predisposed to be fearful of change and what happens in the future. And then, again, we use closed-ended choices because on one end, you've got kids who think they're totally powerful and can rule the world, and you've got other kids who think that they can't, that they're utterly powerless. And so what we're finding is closed-ended choices with the consequences, and I don't mean punishment, it's just the result of whatever action or choice they make. We front-load them at first, and so they understand what choice they're going to make and what's going to happen as a result. And then, of course, the follow-up on those consequences is a very important component in executing that particular behavior program. And we really work with the kids to understand and develop their ability to what are the choices available to you and what do you anticipate the consequences of that being. And then through our therapists and behaviorists, we can correct misperceptions. So one of the words that I actually didn't put down, which is really important, is the idea of these kids communicating with you. It's very important that they communicate with you. And when kids withdraw and stop communicating, it's going to be very difficult to intercede on kids with anxiety disorders and, frankly, with ADHD if they're not talking to you, because all of these components actually require that youngster to have some interaction with you. Consequent. Okay, sure. So here's, I'm going to do this really very simply and very basically. So if you can get to school, okay, we're going to be able to, all we're going to ask you to do is to sit in a classroom. Nobody's going to demand anything of you. We just want you to be exposed to how we're running a classroom. If you choose not to come, then we're going to actually drive out and we're going to take your cell phone away from you until you do come to school. Okay, so you see how we front-loaded it, and then the youngsters make the choice. Now, it's up to us. If that youngster chooses to come to school, that we actually stay with that. There are no demands. All we're asking them to do is observe, and then they begin to see that when they make a choice, the consequences are as we prescribe. And inevitably, most of the kids with anxiety will, in fact, resist coming to school. We've front-loaded them about what will happen, and we do make that happen with the opportunity that if you come the next day, you will get your phone back. Okay, so there's always a resolution. You're always presenting a resolution to the problem. All right, this is Glenn.
So one of the areas that, in addition to changing environment, which is really what we focused on so far, is that we know that there are things going on inside our bodies that are affecting both of these disorders. An area that I know many families have a lot of interest in is nutrition and the effects of what kids are taking in, and are all of these food additives causing problems. The data that we've got, which is fairly extensive, suggests that with younger kids, 3, 4, and 5, a significant number, probably a third, maybe higher, really can show significant behavioral changes depending on what kind of foods that they're doing, and that changing their diet may in fact make a significant difference. The specific influence of food additives and dyes still remains really highly controversial. The amount of effort that's required on the part of the parents to go through and figure out what, if any, of the foods that their kids are eating might be affecting their behavior is a significant dedication of time and energy and sometimes money. And one of the interesting things that people have shown is that, yes, doing that can make a difference, but a part of the difference is that the amount of time that parents and children are spending together increases markedly, because the mom or dad, usually the mom, is constantly watching what the kid's eating and spending a lot of time preparing foods, and the child feels cared for, and that may actually be a part of the benefit that comes from this particular intervention. One of the things that I actually warn about particularly with ADHD, but often anxiety as well, is that you really got to be prepared for the long haul. Things work as long as you do them, and these are chronic illnesses. So when you get into something, you have to ask yourself, not only am I willing to do this for a week to see if it works, but am I going to be able to continue to do that for a month or a year or several years, or potentially far into the future? That makes you anxious, but it really is important, whatever you do, whatever kind of intervention you think about, is this something I can maintain? And if the answer is no, then you may need to rethink about, okay, what can I do that's similar but is less intensive? When I have 2 boys, and when they were younger, they actually saw a star chart, and when we were visiting somebody else's house, and they said, "Wow, that'd be really fun. We'd love to do that. That'd be neat. We can get money or points or whatever." So the 3 of us sat down and worked out a star chart. I'm a professional. I made the worst possible star chart in the world. It was, it had all sorts of if-then things. On Thursdays, if you do, it was just a mess. It lasted, I think, 2 weeks before we all just said, this is not going to work. So you really want to keep things as simple as possible. As Chris said, that idea of consistency for the ADHD kid, it's really literally in writing often. It's putting down, these are the things we expect of you, even though you can't imagine that they haven't figured that out already. Many of them haven't, and even if they have, it's good to be able to good for them to be able to refer to it. And then if you can add a positive, not relatively inexpensive, and it can be something like, I'll spend some more time with you this evening, but some sort of reward for their being able to actually effectively get through that on their own by referring to the chart. It can be very helpful, but they're going to have to continue to do that. It's not that they can do that for a week, then they've internalized it and they can go away. One of the real disappointments for behaviorists when they first started working with ADHD back in the 70s is many of these kids can learn the rules very, very quickly. They used to do the red, yellow, green thing. If I get an impulse, stop, think about the consequences, think about whether they really want to do that, and then go ahead and do it. And the kids can learn that within 5 minutes. The next time they have an impulse, they go out and they do whatever it is, and somebody says, well, why in the world didn't you use that method we taught you? Inevitably, the answer is, I forgot. The real answer is that with ADHD kids, there's very little space between the thought and the action. So they're getting a chance to review the possible consequences. Unlike anxious kids that's all they do, ADHD kids don't think about it. That's part of what medication does, is to spread that out so that they've got more of a chance. They're less impulsive to begin with, but they've got a bit more of a chance to actually think about the possible effects. Probably the most researched area in terms of the use of medications in children and adolescents is with ADHD. There's extensive evidence to support that we've got a number of medications that can be helpful in all of the areas that we've talked about: inattention, distractibility, impulsivity, hyperactivity. None of the medications that we currently have, unfortunately, have any real help with executive functioning, which we haven't talked much about today. That has to do with being able to plan and organize and do things in a systematic, efficient fashion. We're not really, at this point, able to treat that in terms of medication. And the other area that we really don't have medications for is social skills. Now, if we can reduce the impulsivity that kids have, they may be able to make better use of some of the other kinds of behavioral interventions that are done to improve their social skills. But medications per se are not going to suddenly make them social butterflies or the most popular kid in the class. For better or worse, and they're really, you could argue it both ways, the effects of the medicines that we currently have are not permanent. Stimulants are the most common medications, although there are others, and essentially they work the day you give them, and they don't work the days you don't give them. And that some parents really like that because they can help their kids with during school, but on weekends and holidays and summers they can take them off. Other parents get really frustrated because the medicines tend to wear off late in the day, and as kids get older, they've got homework in the evening, and they don't have any of the benefits that medicines might provide for that. Fortunately, we have some other medicines now that can last longer, but they're not stimulants. This is very extensive. We have a number of research groups now that have followed kids over as much as 12 to 15 years. And so far, we've not found any intervention. I said here medications, but it's equally true for behavioral therapy. We've not found any interventions that change the underlying course of ADHD. Now, the good news is that everybody with ADHD gets better over time. The bad news is that the social expectations also rise over time. So even if you're getting better, you may start falling further and further behind because the social expectations are rising faster than your improvement. Most of this has to do with sort of parts of the brain kicking in that allow for more reflection, a little bit more consideration of what other options might I have. My son's a pretty good example of that. He has inattentive ADHD. He still has pretty significant inattention, a little bit of what Chris was talking about. He's got copies of things around so that when he inevitably loses something, he's got a way to do it. He's also making good use of the electronic media now, so he has reminders and calendars and a variety of other things. Despite that, I can assure you, even at 33, he's doing very, very well, but he still will stumble over something that he thought he had covered because he missed a message or an email or a cue that turned out to be difficult for him. For anxiety, the evidence for medication is a little less extensive, but there still is some well-designed, fairly convincing research that we have medications that can benefit kids with anxiety. As with ADHD, the effect of the medications essentially is limited to while you're taking them. It's not quite as dramatic as ADHD, where literally if you don't give a stimulant one day, you'll notice that you didn't give the stimulant that day. What we typically do with anxious kids is recommend at least a year worth of treatment and sometimes more. But even after a year of doing well, having a good response to medication, if all they receive is medications, about 70% of the individuals who go off the medication are going to have anxiety recur within the next few months. Interestingly enough, if you add behavioral interventions so that you help kids think about ways of dealing with anxiety, like deep breathing, looking at their negative thinking, those kinds of things, the addition of those kinds of interventions drops the likelihood that anxiety is going to come back to about 40%. So these kids are still vulnerable, but now they've got tools that when they begin to recognize that their anxiety is rising again, they've got a better chance of controlling it behaviorally. For ADHD, the main medications we have are methylphenidate and amphetamine. These are both stimulants. There's also, actually there are three, the third one we don't use all that much, that have the advantage of being long-lasting. So these, when they work, can really provide 24-hour coverage, which for particularly teenagers can make a big difference. Fortunately, these two are completely compatible, so there are some kids who actually do best with a non-stimulant which provides 24-hour coverage, and then usually a lower dose of a stimulant just on school days and when they really need to be particularly focused. For anxiety, the main treatments are antidepressants, but there are some other agents which include guanfacine, which you'll notice is also useful for ADHD, that also can help reduce anxiety. So if we've got a kid who's got both anxiety and ADHD, guanfacine is often where we might start and might be enough to really help with both states. Sorry, for guanfacine, so guanfacine is either 10X or Intuniv, and atomoxetine is Strattera, and methylphenidate, there are so many, Ritalin is probably the one that people have heard about, but Concerta, Focalin, there are a number of versions, and amphetamine, probably the one that's been most heard about lately, is Adderall. There's an extended release form of that, and there's also a relatively newer version called Vyvanse, which are probably the two most popular amphetamine medications. Antidepressants are usually serotonin reuptake inhibitors is where we start. Those are things like Prozac and Zoloft, there are some others that are not as well studied, but sometimes we use if those don't work. Those antidepressants typically are pretty well tolerated. So if you've got a kid with ADHD or anxiety or both and you're not sure, these are some of the things that we recommend. What I typically don't recommend, even if you're convinced that your kid has just got ADHD, is the pediatric version of an evaluation, which is coming in for 15 minutes, asking you if your kid is hyperactive and causing problems in school, and then prescribing a medication. Because so many of these kids have problems in addition to ADHD, we really recommend an evaluation that looks for other kinds of issues. So for example, about a quarter of kids with ADHD will have some sort of a learning disorder or a speech problem, speech and language problem. There also may be depression. Actually, 40% of kids with ADHD also have something called oppositional defiant disorder, which is a particularly difficult combination. These are kids who just interact mostly by opposing, particularly adults and sometimes peers. Once you've sort of gotten the idea of what it is that you're treating, then there are a variety of therapies that are available in addition to medication. There are increasingly, although still not nearly enough, skill-building groups available on the peninsula. And they're beginning to focus on things like mindfulness, which is just sort of being aware of who you are and how you're feeling. Parent support groups can be really, really important. These kids can be extraordinarily frustrating, and I'm probably preaching to the choir there. And then also, if we find evidence that in addition to ADHD, there are problems with just so-called executive functioning, this has become sort of a cottage industry. There are some excellent executive functioning coaches who really work with the child and with the family to try to provide external supports for dealing with things that other kids are able to deal with, like organizing a multitask, extensive project like in fourth grade, in California, there's the missions project where you've got to pick a mission and you got to study. Have they done away with missions? Darn. I've done so many of those. Oh. All right, so, all of these slides are available on your SCED site. Our talk, there's an attachment, all of these slides. We've got a variety of books, websites that we recommend that could be really helpful in thinking about how to deal with anxiety and ADHD, both. Two I would particularly recommend are Russell Barkley's book, which is really very much directed towards parents and very good. And for anxiety, My Anxious Mind, particularly for teenagers, is an easy read both for teens and for parents, and can be really helpful in sort of thinking about how you can deal with your anxiety. The same author, Michael Tompkins, I didn't put it. He's just put out a sort of a workbook on anxiety as well, which I didn't get listed here. It actually just came out within the last week or two. And then there's another one called If Your Adolescent Has Anxiety. So it's easy. I mean, unfortunately, sort of sorting through which are good books and which aren't so great can be a little difficult. But there is a lot of information. CHAD, if you're not familiar with it, Children and Adults with Hyperactivity and Attention Deficit Disorder, is a parent-led group. They have a very good site with lots of supportive information that can be really quite helpful.
Yeah. So just one last word. I know many of you may have a perception that anxiety and depression are opposite ends of the spectrum. They're actually very close cousins. Let me explain how that happens. So as I explained to you, the whole cycle of anxiety and the fear of the future, and then the perception that you're not going to be able to be successful, and then setting it up so that you are actually failing at, if that cycle continues, then the whole degree of hopelessness increases. And when kids become hopeless, they are more prone to the clinical depression. Which is why if you begin to see symptoms of a youngster whose function in life or ability to function as normal kids do is being impacted, it's really important to jump on it very quickly, because what you don't want to do is get into the depressions, which are really serious, very chronic, and very more difficult to treat. We have had really pretty good success in getting kids to be able to recognize the kinds of situations that they're going to become anxious in and be able to take preventative or anticipatory action. It takes a lot of therapy and a lot of behavioral structuring, but that is possible. We have a much more difficult time, honestly, at EBC once they are identified as clinically depressed. So, actually, you know what? We have 5 minutes for questions before I'm going to have to kick you all out and make sure we get down to the field. So please go ahead and address some questions. Yes. Yeah, does anybody know what the exact website? Okay. Yep, this woman right here actually had the handouts with her, so she can help you out.
Somebody downloaded it on their iPhone.
Yeah. Yeah, I have it on. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Okay. So, yeah, so behavior, yeah, so the question is, a couple of interventions that were mentioned actually have raised anxiety in some situations. And I'm thinking about one where a youngster, because of the behavior that's exhibited in the classroom, ends up with a behavior intervention plan. So, and that's a really good point. This is a mental health condition which has behavioral components. If we do not address the mental health component as well as the behavior component, we're not going to help that youngster actually very effectively. Because what they're going to do is they're going to ruminate or perseverate on the fact that if I don't make this certain behavior happen X number of times, I will not be receiving what I want, and they'll ruminate on that whole process. So the therapeutic component is absolutely has to be embedded. On the other hand, what we need to do with kids is be able to get them to identify their emotional state, the trigger that's onsetting the anxiety, and be able to make some environmental accommodations to mitigate those circumstances, and then B, we do have to hold kids accountable for using the coping strategies that they develop with their therapist, because they have to practice and develop those in order to be able to master it. So it's not just therapy, it's really therapy overseen by a behaviorist who can support, guide, and make sure the youngster is practicing. And if that plan doesn't work, you go back to the therapist, develop a new plan, and it can then be supported by a parent or a behaviorist. Okay, so there is a behavior and a mental health component for sure.
I would add to that there's certainly a concrete example is, and you know, parents really tend to know their kids pretty well. So if you've got an event coming up, there are two types of kids. There are those who really need to know well in advance, because if you spring it on them in the last minute, that is guaranteed to be a disastrous day. There's another type of kid where telling them in advance is absolutely the worst possible thing you could do, because they will then spend the next week worrying about how horrible that's going to be. And that's where parents really come in. This is a collaborative effort. The behaviorists and the mental health specialists have general expertise, but when it comes to applying it to your child, you're the expert. You know what's worked. The other thing which can be difficult at times is anytime you change a behavior, the typical first response is not gratitude. It is, I can't believe you're doing this, because this isn't the dance that we've arranged for the last few years. You sometimes, I mean, you don't want to do something that you don't feel comfortable doing, but you sometimes have to hold to it for a while to convince the child that, yes, the rules have changed. And you can talk about that. I mean, that's not a secret. You can say, yes, we've used to do it this way, we're going to do it this other way now because some idiot told us to do that. And we believe that this is going to be really helpful. But be prepared. I mean, anytime, and this is as true of animals as it is kids, and probably adults, anytime you try to change behavior, the first response is resistance to change. No matter how miserable I am where I am now, the likelihood I'm going to be more miserable in the new position is just too high for me to tolerate. So,
yeah. So what we see oftentimes is that whatever counterproductive strategies have worked for the youngsters, it's at least given them a short respite of emotional relief, even if it has long-term negative consequences, which obviously you all recognize. So we're actually looking at more long-term benefits. So the idea of removing that short-term emotional relief is very threatening to kids when we actually start working with them. And it is something that we have to try to work through to see if, in fact, the combination of the therapeutic and the behavior system works more productively. We have time for one more question. Yes? Sure, yeah. Actually, I'm not sure I can put all the therapeutic components, but we're using a program at EBC called the Ruler Program. This is actually, this has been developed by the folks at Yale University, and it is actually to raise kids what they call emotional literacy. And so this is a program that is designed to be integrated into gen ed populations in the school. General education, yeah. So, or your mainstream classrooms, it does require some training. We've sent some of our staff on it, and we are seeing immediate benefits from staff that do that. So it doesn't require a therapist and an ABA-trained behaviorist. Just raising emotional literacy, expanding kids' vocabulary in the emotional realms, and then getting them to identify their states more accurately and how to take productive action as a result of whatever emotional state you're on is something that can be, in fact, incorporated into less restrictive settings than we have. Okay. We're called Ruler, R-U-L-E-R, and I can't remember what it's an acronym for something, but you'll find it online. Thank you all for coming. You were very attentive. I hope we didn't rush you. You actually deserved more time on this subject, but if you would all go, and you're going to have to go, this is a hike. You're going to go all the way around, and the main, the keynote speaker will be down over by the giant dugout. Okay? Thanks for all for coming.